Hi, today I will be speaking about movement. Movement is what happens outside of the is the manner in which humans interact with the environment, and the movement is implemented through skeletal muscles. We have discussed a lot about how neuronal muscular connections are present, how information is transmitted across neurons into the muscle side, and how muscles work. We have discussed in brief the control systems which are there within muscles, and how basic level controls are there. So, I will just go through the stuff which we already know, and then we will progress on from there. So, first is the idea that neurons link on to muscle fibers. So, that causes signals to be generated. Now, when there is a signal within the neuron that produces synaptic activity over here, and you have this neurotransmitters which are released into this muscle, and that in turn causes muscle activation. So, you got electrical connections, electrical changes which happen, which is basically depolarization within the muscle, and that in turn connects to reduction in length, and I have described this in the previous classes. So, I am not revising that whole thing back again. So, neuron to neuromuscular junction to muscle to contraction. So, that is the brief pathway which is being done. Now, contraction as such is, if you remember, we discussed about how action potentials are there, and even at the NMJ you create a fixed quanta of there is a fixed quanta of neurotransmitters which are released, and that signal is conveyed. Of course, there is amplification which can which happens in the transfer of information. This also there is another transformation, and then you get an muscle action potential. So, that in turn causes the contraction. So, what is seen here is it is a very linear process. So, one neuron produces a signal that produces a muscle contraction, and there is it is a very linear transformation. But where all real world situations have a lot of uncertainty, and we need to find out how uncertainty is handled at various levels. So, let me split up this the issue of movement about what are the challenges, posture, locomotion, and mechanism. So, what are the challenges involved in generating movement, purposeful movement? What is meant by posture, what is meant by locomotion, and the mechanism of the known mechanisms of all these control systems. I will start out with challenges. So, challenges is one is I have spoken about grading the power. You have to ensure there is a power output which is proportional to the task. There is a task, and then the second thing is mapping. So, that sort of requires a coordinate system. Right. So, you need a manifold, and then that within that manifold or coordinate system you need to perform these actions. So, then you have you need to what you call synchronize actions, And yeah, I think I will start out with each of these things and then progress on to something. So, I was describing about one neuron producing one action potential producing NMJ, which has got a fixed quanta of neurotransmitters that causes one single contraction. So, at the basic level we need to see how this can be made nonlinear. So, yeah, so nonlinearity is with the idea of graded contractions. So, that is implemented through recruitment of motor units. So, we have three different kinds of movements we need to think of. So, motor tasks can be fine, that can be coarse. So, fine indicates that you need to have a good resolution of motor activity. What do I mean by that? Activity. So, drawing a line is very different from drawing a diagram, right. So, there is this would form as sort of coarse and this would be fine. So, we look in my regular handwriting versus calligraphy. So, there is a big difference between the kind of work which is implemented in regular handwriting or just scribbling or versus calligraphy in which everything is set. So, fine indicates that there is a lot more control required for the motor activity. The limits of your are not limits, the tolerance of your proposed motor activity is very narrow. And it not just about writing, you can have very fine motor tasks which have to be done. Now, it need not be in terms of say performing surgery in which you have to do something which is very fine, but even in sports such as tennis you need to, or cricket, in which you have to have very good hand eye coordination. You have got a ball which is in a very large view space of the eye, and then you have to track it and then hit it in very defined way. So, though that also constitutes fine, because that differentiates a good player from somebody who is not so good. So, that kind of fineness, how does it happen is it needs to be thought of. So, I will start with what is a motor unit. Single neuron, every single neuron ends up in multiple skeletal muscle fibers. So, based on the size of the neuron, you can have multitudes of fibers connected to a single neuron. The difference between this is you activate only a small amount of muscle fibers, whereas here you activate multiple muscle fibers. So, power of generated is higher, whereas power here is lower. So, you have a biological mechanism of having different activities mapped onto different kinds of neurons. So, what does that mean? Suppose you have a single neuron which is generating the generating activity, and this particular neuron has has got a very fine task or something which requires less amount of power or precise amount of power. So, what happens is it generates EPSPs over here, EPSPs over here. So, since this neuron is smaller in size, the EPSP results in an action potential which is faster. So, a smaller amount of current generates an EPSP and that in turn recruits this motor unit. So, this whole thing from here to here is a motor unit. Now, if the signal is higher, there is larger amount of signal which is generated, that produces a larger EPSP for the larger neuron, and that in turn recruits the entire set of neurons when it is stimulated. So, you have smaller amount of signal generating the smaller motor unit and the larger amount of signal generating the larger unit. So, that is one of the mechanisms of control. So, you have numerous such kinds of neurons ending up in motor units, and you based on the task. So, you can recruit multiple motor units for the particular given task. So, that is how you can scale up responses. So, individual neurons end up in individual set of muscle cells, but recruiting multiple such motor units can help you in scaling up responses across a wide range. Now, training sort of you train to a particular task. So, there are synaptic changes which happen over here, synaptic changes which can happen over here, and you can have muscle bulk which increases if you have you have done some specific exercise. So, muscle improves its bulk with training and exercise, and repeated stimulation of a particular pathway results in increased bulk of the muscle. So, that is how you have better control and better finer movements generated from the pathway. So, different motor units are used to are assigned to a task. So, this assignment way of assignment is what has been shown over here. The next challenge which I am addressing is the coordinate system. Now, the brain is enclosed within the skull, and it has its inputs which go into the brain, and then you have the outputs. So, output in general is muscles, but inputs in turn are not very not very specific. You got so many kinds of inputs, primarily visual, then you got sensory as in touch, pressure, joint position, sense, and you also have auditory. So, all of these things have to be integrated in the brain, and the output is what is implemented within by the muscle. So, you need to have a mapping system. Now, in individual classes I have told you that visual the system has a map of the 3D environment. So, that is a map which is built within and stored somewhere within your cortex. Now, there is also mapping of the sensory cortex. Sensations within the cord, within the cord, within the brainstem, they are conveyed through individual selected paths, which is hardwired based on the anatomical location. So, anatomically coded. And that goes into specific representations of the sensory cortex. Auditory, I spoke about tonotopic maps, which is frequency coded. And also intensity coded. So, intensity can in turn result in, you get an auditory map. So, you got different frequencies which are taken up from the ear, and then you get information from both the ears, which will give you a directional sense of sound and the quality of the sound, far, near, etc., coming into the ear, and that is coded within your head. So, what I mean to say, what I want to convey here is that you got different maps which are generated. So, you have a sensory map, you have a visual map, and then you have an auditory map. So, these results in something you can call as a state map. State map for the organism or for the human being. So, these state maps are updated by individual sensations. So, visual maps of course are much faster, because one, there is a large amount of data which is coming into the eye, and it is only about this much, that is about 10 centimeters. The sensory maps are more complex, because you get signals from all the way from the feet up to the head, and the signals come at different phases. So, because transmission within the nervous system, though myelinated fibers have maximum limits. So, you get information which is continuously taken, and remember, these are not on off kind of systems, these are continuously on, and then it is only the signal signal amplitude changes. Remember, signal amplitude is not action potential amplitude, it is signal amplitude. So, amount of data which is coming from the various receptors, sense receptors which are there in every single square millimeter of your body, they convey information, and these are coded into specific regions within the thalamus, within the sensory cortex, and there is a map. It's not you can't say where in your head that map is, but individual parts of the cortex get in information from specific regions of the body. So, ultimately all of these would result in a state map. So, state maps are generated within the head. Now, an interesting problem is these state maps are not interchangeable. So, visual map is on is a spherical map of your environment. The sensory map is your own body representation, and auditory map is from both the sides. So they don't you cannot have a 3D coordinate system. I use the term manifold for that reason. So, you have the brain represents outside space through these various modalities, sensory modalities within the brain, and then you have a state map. So, there was a concept earlier that the state map is there in the parietal cortex, and that is what is updated continuously. But the more current theory is that you have individual maps of this kind, sensory map within the sensory cortex, visual map within the associatory visual areas. You got auditory maps which are coming into the posterior temporal lobe, and so all of these maps sort of communicate with each other. It is a distributed mapping system. So, different parts of the mapping system are updated and you have state functions derived based upon that. Now, why is it important? So, the act of drawing a straight line, you know, if you look at it, it looks very very trivial, but if we look at it in terms of you know in terms of coordinate system and how it is implemented. So, you have a start point and then you have an end point, and then you have a vector which is drawn from the start point to the end point. The difficulty arises that, you know, as an instruction which is passed on to the brain, the it looks like it is a Euclidean coordinate system, but every single joint has a spherical coordinate system, spherical or 2 dimensional. 2 dimensional is angle based. I do not know what the angular coordinate system. So, every joint, you look at all of your joint or most of your joints, you can find that, you know, there is an arc which is generated. So, you know, you have an arc which is generated, and that arc can which is either in 2 dimensional space, say for example elbow, or in 3 dimensional space, say for example the shoulder. Now, these arc movements, you know, of every single joint would need to be mapped on to the Euclidean space. So, that is a real challenge. So, you have 3 dimensional XYZ coordinate systems, and then you have a spherical coordinate system which is the internal one, and the spherical coordinate system has to be mapped onto the 3 dimensional space. So, the next activity which I would like to speak about is synchronization.